Welcome back. Super excited. Moving forward, I'm going to talk about the newer aspect of EC2. Notice there is a dashboard where you can now visualize, take a look at all of your resources and options that you have available within the EC2 dashboard. You can always go back to the old dashboard, but the new experience adds new resources and options. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about the placement groups within EC2. So when you launch a new EC2, for example, the EC2 service simply attempts to place the instance in such a manner that all of your instances are spread across underlying hardware. And the purpose of this is to provide fault tolerance, to minimize failures, in other words. We can use these placement groups influence the placement of group of interdependent instances. Okay, what that means is in order to simply think of this as meeting the needs of your workload. So depending on your workload type, you can then create a placement group, one of these strategies. So the first strategy is cluster, the second strategy is partition, and the third strategy is spread. So what do we mean by cluster? Pretty straightforward. All it does is simply takes all of the instances close together inside a single availability zone. So what this allows you to do is simply enables your workloads to achieve low latency network performance for tightly coupled node-to-node communication. And that's typical of the HPC applications. The second strategy is partition. And what this strategy would do for you regarding your EC2 instances is spread your instances across logical partitions, such as groups of instances in one partition that do not share any resources. So all of the resources stay within that group of those instances in different partitions, right? So each partition has instances and they remain independent. So this strategy is typically used by large distributed workloads, maybe if you're working with Hadoop, Cassandra, or Kafka. And finally, the third strategy is that it strictly places small groups of instances across distinct underlying hardware. And of course, this is high fault tolerant. Good news is that there's no charge for creating a placement group. So before I do the demo, and I'm going to of course provide the demo after we go through 5 or 6 slides, just so that you understand the concept, then I'm going to demonstrate how to create these placement groups. Next, let's take a look at the cluster placement groups. The cluster placement group is simply, once again, a logical grouping of your EC2 instances within a single availability zone. And this can basically, you can span tiered VPCs within the same region, right? And the real benefit of the cluster placement group is that in addition to the 10 gigabyte flow limit, the real benefit is the non-blocking, non-oversubscribe, and fully bisectional nature of connectivity. What do these all mean, right? So think of this as that all nodes within the placement group can talk to all other nodes within the same placement group at a full line rate of 10 gigabits and 100 gigs aggregate without any slowing down due to over subscription. So think of this as, in layman terms, is that you have multiple EC2 instances within the same availability zones, and each instance is connected, fully connected, and sharing all of the information. Okay, so that's really the cluster placement groups. Now, when do we use cluster placement groups? They're recommended for applications that benefit from low network latency, high network throughput, or both. And if the majority of the network traffic is between the instances in the group, that's when you really use the cluster placement group. So it is also recommended that you launch a number of instances that you need in the placement group in a single launch request. Because since you'll be using those together anyways, right? So it makes sense to launch multiple instances within a one placement group. And that you use the same instance type for all instances. If you're using, let's say, Linux AMI type instance, then you want to spin up 3 AMI based instances, right, within the same placement group. Next, let's take a look at partition placement groups. That's one of the strategies that you can also use. They simply help reduce the likelihood of correlated hardware failure for your application. So once again, when using these partition placement groups, the EC2 simply divides each group into logical segments called partitions. This is similar to your disk partitions, right? You have a C drive, you have a D drive, and you have an E drive, F drive, right? So think of those in layman terms as just going to take these EC2 instances and place them into logical partitions. And what this does, that EC2 ensures that each partition within the placement group has its own set of racks. Each rack has its own network and power source, so they're independent, right? So no two partitions within the same group share the same rack. The real benefit here is that it isolates the impact of hardware failure within your application. So in this particular example that you see, the image below is a simple representation of a partition placement group in a single availability zone. What it does, it shows you the instances that are placed into partitions. Placement group with 3 partitions, 1, 2, and 3. Now each partition comprises of multiple instances, and they do not share racks. Now the groups, the partition placement groups, can be used to deploy large distributed and replicated workloads. Maybe if you want to use Cassandra or HDFS across distinct racks. So basically what happens is when you launch instances into a partition placement group, EC2 simply tries to distribute the instances evenly across the number of partitions that you specify. And we can also launch instances into a specific partition to have more control over where the instances are actually placed. The partition placement group can also, by the way, have partitions in multiple availability zones in the same region. So they're not limited to just a single AZ, but you can have multiple AZs. This type of group can basically have a maximum of, let's say, 7 partitions per availability zones. And they also offer, visibility into partitions. You can see which instances are in which partitions. You can share this information with the topology-aware applications, for example, Cassandra, HDFS, like I mentioned earlier. And these applications use this information to make intelligent data replication decisions for increasing data availability and durability. So you ought to know the benefits and when should you use basically the partition placement groups. Next, let's take a look at finally the spread placement group, which is simply a group of instances that are each placed on distinct racks, with each rack having its own network and power source. Very similar to what we talked earlier, right? So here you can see in this image that you can have 7 instances in a single availability zone that are placed into a spread placement group. Now you might be thinking, why should I use a spread placement groups? And these are simply recommended for applications that have a small number of critical instances kept separate from each other. So launching these type of instances, for example, within a spread placement group will reduce the risk of simultaneous failures that might occur when instances share the same rack. And they also provide access to distinct racks, therefore suitable for mixing instance types or launching instances over time. And they can, of course, also span multiple availability zones within the same region. You can have maximum of 7 running instances per availability zone group. Next, let's take a look at some of the general rules and limitations. Now, there are several rules and limitations specifically related to the placement groups, but here I'm just going to highlight some of the important limitations. So before we actually use the groups, you need to know certain rules and limitations of utilizing or implementing these groups. First, the name you specify for a placement group must be unique within your AWS account for the region. So let's say if you have multiple accounts, and typical companies, enterprise companies, have multiple AWS accounts, right? So you ought to kind of remember that placement group must be unique within your AWS account for the region. Second, you cannot merge placement groups. They're independent of each other. So if you're using a cluster strategy versus a spread strategy, they are independent. Third, an instance can be launched in one placement group at a time. It cannot span multiple placement groups. Pretty straightforward. Fourth, the on-demand capacity reservation and reserved instances provide a capacity reservation for EC2 instances within a specific availability zone. So what this means is basically the capacity reservation can be used by EC2 instances within a placement group. it's not possible to explicitly reserve capacity for a placement group. And finally, we have the instances with a tenancy of host cannot be launched within a placement group. So these are some of the general rules and limitations that are important for you to know regarding the placement groups within EC2. Next, let's take a look at a demo. Promised, I'm going to demonstrate how to create these placement groups and how to place those EC2 instances in your placement groups and whichever strategy that you use within your own project. So now that I'm on my dashboard, notice this is the management console. I'm going to navigate to first EC2, and this will bring up the EC2 dashboard. On the top left, you'll notice the new EC2 experience. So if you would like to revert back to the old EC2 dashboard, you can simply switch from here. If not, of course, you will have the new EC2 experience. Now, within this particular dashboard, if you scroll down from the left navigation, you will notice within network and security section, placement groups. So if you click on it, you will see no placement groups because we have not created any, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create placement group. Click on this, give it a name, straightforward. I'm going to call it ClayDesk placement group or ClayDesk-PG. And then here's the strategy. So I can select either a cluster strategy, spread strategy, or a partition-based strategy. So let's go ahead and cluster first. Now you could always use the AWS command line interface command. As soon as I click on the arrow here, you'll notice it'll provide you the command itself. In other words, if you were to run this command, it's going to go ahead and create the cluster, which is simply AWS EC2 create placement group, provide the group name, which is ClayDesk PG, strategy is cluster, and the region is US East 1. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and simply create our first placement group, click create, and this is going to go ahead and simply create the group for you. Now I could also go back to this button, create placement group, and create another group. So let's go ahead and do that. Go ahead and click on this. I'm going to call this my PG, right? And then here I'm going to choose spread, click create. And similarly, I'm going to go ahead and quickly create a third placement group, PG here. And then of course, in this instance, I'm going to use the partition based. Now, as soon as I choose partition, it asks me the number of partitions that I want to use. So if I want to use 1, 2, or 3, or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, I could. Now, remember, you can have up to 7 if I don't. Yeah, perfect. So you can have within this placement group maximum number of 7 partitions, right? So I'm going to choose 3 as partitions and click create. So now that you have 3 different placement groups, our next task would be to create EC2 instances and place them within any of these placement groups. So let's go ahead, scroll up to our instances, click on instances. So currently I have 2 stopped instances. I'm going to go ahead and launch an instance just so that I can demonstrate how you can place this particular instance within a respective placement strategy. So here I'm going to choose, I guess, any one of these, but I'm going to, just for demonstration purposes, select the first Linux AMI. I'm going to choose the T2 micro, which is by default, right? Free tier available. So click on next, configure instance details. Now this is where you will see an option called placement group, which of course, if you're using the old version of EC2 instance, this is something new, right? And of course, good for the exam as well. So within this option here, I can simply click on this checkbox, add instances to placement group, and then I can simply choose the placement group. So notice in the drop down arrow, I have 2 displayed strategies. One is spread, the other is partition. Wait a minute, what about the cluster strategy? We also created a third group called the cluster placement group, but that does not show here. And here's the reason why, and this is a good exam question too. You cannot create or you cannot add an EC2 instance to a cluster placement group if you're using a T2 micro. So remember, we selected the T2 micro, right? So you cannot add a T2 micro instance within a cluster. That's why, AWS doesn't show you the option here. If I were to go back, for example, let's go back here, previous. Instead of T2 micro, I'm going to choose, let's say, scroll down. Let's pick one of these. So let's go ahead and do, let's say, M5 large, right? Just for demo. Click next. So it just gives you the option here. You've selected a different instance type and gives you the option. Yes, I'd like to continue with this instance type, M5.24x large. Click next. And now if I try to click on the drop down arrow, perfect. You will see that you have the option of using a cluster. Okay, so this way you can of course navigate and click on the next, which is add storage, which is straightforward. Add tags, configure security groups in the next option, right? If you have a default security group or an existing security group, you can do so. Again, rest of the options are pretty straightforward. So if I were to click on review and launch, it's going to go ahead and launch this particular EC2 instance within my cluster placement strategy group. Okay, so I'm not going to go ahead and review and launch, but just for demo purposes, you fully understand the EC2 placement group strategies. So based on your own project, your infrastructure, your AWS architecture, for example, or your applications, you can choose the right placement strategy for your EC2 instances. So I hope this helped. Practice with this. If you have any questions, post in the discussion area. I'll be glad to help with this. Let's move to the next lesson.